because we don't have a topic for today, I wanted to go ahead and get straight to callers. And up first, we've got Stephanie in Tampa. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. I know that there's a question here, and I will, of course, get to your question and let you ask whatever you wanted or talk about that. But there's one thing that I wanted to get out of the way first for clarity, because it seems that you and I perhaps got off on the wrong foot.
Yes, I think so. And I think we can turn that around.
I woke up to some tweets, a barrage of tweets, one might say, being directed at me. And one of them was, you claimed that you were writing a rebuttal to something I'd said at my blog, except I don't have a blog. And
Right. You said it was a wiki.
Then I realized that you were talking about iron chariots. And then I pointed out that the things that you were replying to weren't necessarily things that I had written at Iron Chariots, because
I know you didn't want to take credit for them. I don't blame you.
Well, you don't. You've said that on Twitter as well. Like you have this idea that I don't want to take credit for them. Of course I don't. Somebody else wrote it. I believe they should get credit for their work. But you portrayed this as me disassociating myself or denouncing the wiki, and that's not true. That was just me clarifying that you're basically announcing that you're rebutting me when in fact you're rebutting somebody else.
Well, maybe it would be nice if you had the authors cite their names on wiki so I could give them all credit for everything that they've written.
Well, you do know that it's a wiki, and you can go to the history page and you can see who made what edits. I think there's a problem with just assuming that because I created a wiki a dozen years ago, that I wrote everything on it. As a matter of fact, I wrote only a tiny portion of it, and some of that's been edited as well. So to be clear, I'm not disassociating myself from it. I'm not denouncing it. It may be that the arguments that you wrote rebuttals to are things that I perhaps agree with. I just don't want to be given credit. And I don't understand this need to keep going, I'm rebutting Matt Dillon, because I'm irrelevant. The arguments are either correct or incorrect, independent of who said them, right?
Well, the arguments are always the same arguments.
I don't know how that actually addresses
you and Bertrand Russell and all the different people. So,
okay, I don't know how that's relevant to the point, but so at least do we acknowledge that you're running around saying you're rebutting me when in fact you aren't?
Well, here's what I can do. I'll change the rebuttal to say, instead of rebutting you, I'll say I'm rebutting the Iron Chariots wiki page. How about that? Would that work out fine? See,
and that's perfectly fine, because you also went back when you were trying to tie me to Iron Chariots and found a 10-year-old bio from the Atheist Community of Austin. It's not your fault that it hadn't been updated, but it made me kind of at least somewhat question what the goals were here. Because when I take an argument for the existence of God that somebody's presented, I either clearly identify who wrote this particular version I'm talking about, or I just ignore that and focus on the content. Because it doesn't matter to me whether you said it, or William Lane Craig said it, or Irenaeus said it, or St. Anselm wrote it. It's the content of the argument. That stands or falls independent of who it is.
Okay.
That's correct, I'm assuming, right?
Well, the content of the argument certainly is important.
Why would it remotely be relevant who said it? How does that affect the content?
I'm just trying to figure out why you keep disassociating yourself from this wiki page. I don't understand. You put it on your bio, you put a link to it on your bio, and then you said you haven't looked at it in years. It seems kind of unusual to put something on your bio that you haven't actually looked at in years.
Here's the thing, Stephanie. You found a bio from 10 years ago or more.
Why would you have it posted on the internet, a bio from 10 years ago?
I don't run that page from the Atheist Community of Austin. Did you perhaps, and by the way, if you went to my Wikipedia page, that's more up to date. But you have once again claimed that I'm disassociating myself from Iron Chariots when I just explained to you that that's not the case.
You don't want to. This is very amusing to me, because you basically have a link, an old bio with an old link. Apparently, you haven't looked at it in 10 years.
Some website
that I give credit to these other authors on Wiki. I have no problem doing that. I'll find all the other authors and find all the other links.
You do realize, Stephanie, that even 10 years ago, when that bio was new, that it didn't in any way suggest that I wrote everything at Iron Chariots, right? You do understand what a wiki is.
I understand that, especially I'm sure that you're trying to disassociate yourself from the webpage that says, I don't know. I mean, there's an entire webpage to explain
Stephanie.
the word, I don't know. I mean, obviously that's the answer that you guys have for every argument that's out there, whether it's a teleological argument, a cosmological argument. It's always, I don't know.
What's wrong with that?
After a while, cognitive dissonance would result.
Well, first of all, I'd like to know exactly what's wrong with the I don't know thing, but I would really like you to stop saying that I'm disassociating myself from something when I've expressly pointed out that I'm not. All I was doing was clarifying that your claim that I wrote something was factually incorrect. I do not know whether or not I agree or disagree with the content that you're rebutting. I don't know if perhaps I think it's a great argument or a mediocre argument. We're not in, I haven't even looked at this stuff, and yet you're claiming that I'm disassociating, and all I'm doing is saying, you claimed I wrote something, I'm pointing out I didn't.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay. So what was it you wanted to talk about?
Well, I just want to thank you first for bringing me on the show. I know that we did get off on the wrong foot, and there's been some tweets that have gone back and forth that weren't in the friendliest tone. It's in some ways. So I do want to thank you for having me on the show. And I have a number of atheist friends on Twitter, and that's actually how I found out about your show. And so they have been recommending that I get on the show, I think because they want to watch me get pummeled by you. So I'll just put it up there that that's what they're hoping to watch. They've all got popcorn out now and they're listening and hoping that I get a good pummeling. So we have that coming.
Well, we'll see what we do. It's not always so big thing is that my goal here is to actually talk about the arguments, talk about what people believe, why they believe it, and then point out why I do or don't agree. There are people who view some of that as a pummeling. There are people who feel that, you're just... So one of the biggest, most common complaints that I get is, why do you only let the ridiculous people call in? And when I get that in email, I'm like, okay, well then why don't you call in? Or why don't you have your pastor call in? Or why don't you recommend your favorite, apologist call in? Because I'm not picking who calls in. Anybody can dial the phone number and theists get priority. So... But there was an issue or a question that you had or something you wanted to address?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about early Christians.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask you what you thought about the early Christians, and especially the apostles and the other early disciples of Christ who were so brave at the time and were willing to take being stoned. They were willing to be tortured, put in jail. Perpetua, which was one of the first martyrs, basically had written up an account of that, and there's a number of others who've written up accounts of sort of the way that they were treated by Nero. And so I wanted to ask you what you thought drove them to be so brave.
Well, I think that most of them were probably convinced that that their beliefs were correct. But the willingness to be brave or even be hurt or killed for your beliefs doesn't tell us anything at all about whether or not your beliefs are true or likely to be true. There are, I've watched Buddhists set themselves on fire. There are people who tragically flew planes into buildings based on, at least in part, some of their religious doctrines. But at the end of the day, my concern is whether or not are they correct in their beliefs. And the truth about whether or not they're correct isn't impacted in any way by the number of people who believe something or how passionately they believe it or what they're willing to put up with. There are people who are willing to put up with a lot and die, and it doesn't mean that they are dying for a lie. They might be dying for an error.
Okay, fair enough. So let me build on that. And so we'll go back to the story of the apostles. And if you take a look at the apostles, initially Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. The apostles were in hiding. And if they had not seen Jesus, they wouldn't have come out of hiding. There have been many traditions, and there have also been documents of the apostles and others, early Christians such as Stephen, dying gory deaths. And others have seen Jesus. People saw Jesus People had seen Jesus rise, and had they not seen him rise, they wouldn't have been so brave.
Somebody saw Jesus. Somebody saw Jesus rise.
How many Buddhists saw anything? How many Muslims saw anything? The early apostles actually saw something, and that's what made them so brave.
So, first of all, you're saying the only reason they would have come out of hiding is if they'd seen Jesus. I don't know how you reached that conclusion. Second of all, you said
exactly. Why else would they have come out of hiding?
Well, that's an argument from ignorance fallacy. You don't get just
No,
to,
it's not. No, it's not an argument from ignorance.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Stephanie, Stephanie, if your claim...
They came out from hiding because they had seen something.
Stephanie,
it's very, very clear. Why did
oh
they
my
get so
God.
brave?
Stephanie, you claimed the only reason they would come out is if they'd seen Jesus. And when I asked you what your justification for that was, you literally said, why else would they come out? That is by definition. That is by definition. By definition, an argument from ignorance fallacy.
Fallacy. The only fallacy you should be concerned
do you care about logical fallacies? Do you care about making a sound argument?
Logical fallacy is the cognitive dissonance you must be having when you don't realize why the apostles got so brave.
Stephanie, that's not my question. Do you care? Do you understand that a fallacious argument cannot be demonstrated to be correct? That is what a fallacy is.
You can try to capture this as if it's a fallacy. This is not a fallacy.
So first of all, it is, but that's not my question, Stephanie.
And that's how they were able to convince millions of people to
Are you capable of answering the actual question? Are you capable of answering the actual question I asked instead of going on defensive and redirecting to something else?
No, because you're redirecting.
You're not capable of doing that? You're not capable of actually answering
the... You are redirecting, Matt.
I'm not redirecting. I'm asking you.
You are. I asked the question.
All right, your ass is on hold so that you don't talk over me. I will take you off in just a moment. All I've asked that I'd like an answer to is, do you understand that a logically fallacious argument cannot be demonstrated to be true? Doesn't mean it's not, that the conclusion isn't true. It just means that you have no good reason to...
Relevant to the current question.
You were still talking to... I'm the one who...
It's not relevant to the current issue. It's not a logically fallacious argument.
Stephanie, I'm asking a question. You can say it's not relevant all you want, but it's my show, and I'm asking it...
You're trying to shift the goalposts there, Matt.
No, I'm trying to find out if I'm talking to someone who is willing to base arguments in reason, or if they're just going to make assertions and dismiss fallacies.
Matt, you're not making any sense. Think about this. The apostles were in hiding. They feared for their lives. Why do you think they came out?
Maybe they got hungry.
Why do you think they were so brave? Peter was hung upside down. Why do you think Paul was so brave?
I already explained,
on the road
Stephanie.
To Damascus, he would not have been so brave, and he wouldn't have written at least 6 of the New Testament books.
How do you know any of this?
I already explained that I'm fine with the idea that they were sincerely convinced they were correct. What I asked was, do you understand that an argument that is logically fallacious, the conclusion cannot be considered reasonably to be true?
You're trying to wrap my
If you don't answer my question, I swear I will hang up on you because you are wasting time.
Of course I'm wasting time.
Not anymore, you're not. Not anymore. This is one of the common questions that I get when I'm traveling around and people talk about, how do you engage with believers? What do you do when someone refuses to accept reason as a foundation? That's what you do. You set aside the entire topic of discussion because Jesus is irrelevant to logic. The specifics of any argument for something is irrelevant with respect to whether or not we begin with a foundation of reason. There is incredibly, the reason that we begin with an understanding of let's not make fallacious arguments is because there's a logical structure, a syllogistic structure. And there are 256 different ones, which Aristotle and his band of merry logicians went through and analyzed to show that of these 256, these particular structures are such that a true premise necessarily leads to a true conclusion. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. That structure, no matter what you put in there, as long as your premises are true, the structure guarantees that your conclusion is true. And more accurately, if you accept the premises, you must accept the conclusion, otherwise you are by definition being irrational. You are just denying the conclusion. The structure of the argument goes to its validity. The content of the argument goes to whether or not it's sound. And so you could have an argument that is valid in structure, but if you plug in a premise that isn't true, then you have no reason to think that your conclusion is true. Okay? And so if your premise is the only reason, or your conclusion is the only reason they would come out of hiding was because they saw the risen Jesus, in a discussion about why they did certain things, you're not even making an argument, you're just making an assertion. And when I try to point this out and you say, well, what other reason could there be? That is by definition a fallacy. That is, hey, the butler did it. Well, what evidence do you have that the butler did it? Well, who else could have done it? That is the fallacy that Stephanie's engaged in. And my only reason for addressing that was so that we could actually talk about the content that we perhaps disagree on. But Stephanie begins with this idea of there were these people who believed and they were willing to die for their beliefs, and the only thing that would make them come out of hiding was if they actually saw the risen Jesus. That is a bald assertion that you have no evidence. Well, it's common sense. Well, it's common sense to you, but that's because you don't understand the importance of avoiding fallacious reasoning. Your common sense is flawed. You have been duped into thinking things are reasonable when they're not. Reasonableness is demonstrated, not asserted. But let's say that these apostles believed these things, and then they also believed that they saw the risen Jesus and this brought them out of hiding. Does that tell us that they actually did see a risen Jesus, or just that they were convinced of it? Or, and this is the damning thing that we didn't get to, how do you know, as John was asking, any of that happened? You have a book that claims it happened. You have stories of translations of stories that were written by people who had an intent and a goal of convincing you of the truth of this. So I might say, to use one of Stephanie's favorite arguments, that aspects of this story were intentionally constructed to make it appear more convincing and weren't actually tied to the truth of the events. Oh, the apostles were in hiding and they came out. That's exactly what you'd write if you wanted to convince somebody. Now, it's an awful argument. It's just as bad as hers, because now I'm claiming that I have an explanation. The truth is, I don't know, which I know just frustrates Stephanie to no end. Oh, the Iron Chariots Wikipedia has an entry on I don't know as an answer. Yeah, do you know why it's there? I haven't even read it. But I'm guessing that it's there because I don't know is entirely frustrating to theists. They arrogantly presume that not only should they know, but that in fact they do know, and that they've come to the right answer and they can't be fooled. And it's really frustrating when skeptics, when they're asked, hey, what explanation do you have for this? And we say, I don't know. I don't even have the facts. What you've shown me is a book. You haven't shown me the corroboration to show that this actually happened. This goes back to the debate that I did 2 weeks ago, and after this we'll get to another caller, on the resurrection of Jesus. My opponent presented 2 lines of evidence to defend his position that Jesus rose from the dead. The first line of evidence was a bunch of arguments that the supernatural is real. All of his claims were flawed. They were bald assertions that you couldn't demonstrate, and you cannot conclude that the supernatural is real just because somebody thinks they saw a ghost. Similarly, you cannot conclude that Jesus rose from the dead just because somebody thinks they saw it, or worse, somebody writes a story that somebody thinks they saw it. His second line of evidence was, hey, there's historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, that's the only part of his opening that was remotely relevant, and you know what that consisted of? Nothing. No physical evidence, no independent corroboration. The entirety of it was Paul believed, and other people believed Paul, and therefore we should consider this reasonable. It is a fallacy parade with theists, particularly with evangelical Christians, who are absolutely cocksure that they have the one and only right answer, so much that when you challenge them on why they believe it, their answer is inevitably, well, what else could it be? Well, congratulations. You've now removed yourself from reasoned discourse on this. There is no scientific discipline, there is no historical discipline that would ever occur where you would walk in and give your paper to say, I think that the best explanation is this, and when somebody says, what evidence do you have for that? You say, what else could it be? You get nowhere that way. And the fact that you don't recognize this is part and parcel of the foundation of why you wanted to mock on Twitter. Oh, all you atheists, you just keep saying, I don't know, I don't know. All the arguments are the same that come from Bertrand Russell, etc. First of all, I'm not presenting arguments that God doesn't exist. I'm exposing flaws in the arguments that God does exist. Your failure to meet your burden of proof, your utter reliance on argument from ignorance fallacies, your incredible, almost impossibly difficult the difficult time you have with saying I don't know when that may in fact be the correct answer, those three things combined serve as the foundation of your religious beliefs. And the proof is, if you had evidence and you cared about logical argument, when I asked you that, you would have said, of course I care about logical arguments. Of course I understand why fallacious arguments shouldn't be presented. And yes, as a matter of fact, I do have evidence. But you don't. And your brain put you in defensive mode, and you made a fool of yourself.
Sometimes I don't know is the only honest answer.
How do you know that? I'm sorry, I was channeling Cy for just a second.
Yeah, it's not a virtue to claim you know something that you don't have any good reason to know. And I don't know is sometimes the best answer you can hope for, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah,
it's ridiculous, this idea that I don't know is somehow a weaker position than I do know, when you can't support it. So, for her to mock that is just it's posturing.